So back in 1903, Marie Curie actually became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, which is incredible.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and she basically spent her entire life pioneering research on radioactivity. So she was handling these lethal, highly unstable materials like every single day in her lab.
Right, just incredibly dangerous stuff.
Exactly. Yet she famously wrote this line, "Nothing in life is to be feared, only understood." And today we are taking her, ruthlessly scientific approach to fear, and we're kind of crashing it head on into deep, ancient biblical theology.
It's a fascinating combination.
It really is. So, welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and we're unpacking a really unique framework from our source material today. It bridges secular rationality and faith-based promises to tackle, well, pretty much one of the more universal human experiences for you listening, overcoming paralyzing fear.
And I'm your expert for this deep dive. And just to set the parameters for you right now, while the text we're exploring is explicitly rooted in scripture and spiritual promises, our mission today is to objectively deconstruct the mechanics of this advice.
Right, to really see how it works under the hood.
Exactly. We want to analyze exactly how this text structures the journey from being, completely overwhelmed by a phobia to achieving genuine functional peace of mind.
So we have to start with that Marie Curie quote,
Yeah.
right? Because using a physicist to introduce a profoundly spiritual framework it's definitely an unexpected anchor.
It really is.
The text uses her philosophy as its foundational premise. So
Yeah.
step one is get the facts about what you fear to take away the mystery and misinformation from it. But wait, if a fear is deeply physiological?
Like a real panic response?
Yeah, like if my heart is racing and my palms are sweating, how does simply gathering data about my phobia actually stop that physical panic? Like, how does data help?
Well, to understand why the text starts here, we really have to look at the underlying mechanics of how the human brain processes uncertainty.
Okay.
When you're confronted with an unknown variable, the mystery the text refers to, your brain's fear center, the amygdala, immediately takes over.
Oh, right, the lizard brain.
Exactly. And it operates significantly faster than your conscious thought. And because its primary job is just to keep you alive, when it lacks data, it doesn't just, guess calmly.
It freaks out.
It completely catastrophizes. It fills in the blank with the absolute worst case scenario.
So the misinformation the text mentions, it isn't necessarily a lie someone else told you, right? It's the survival narrative your own brain is fabricating just because it doesn't have the full picture.
Precisely. The brain perceives a void of information as an immediate threat.
Wow, okay.
So what the text is arguing by telling you to get the facts is that you have to force a cognitive override.
A cognitive override. I like that.
Yeah, when you start gathering empirical data about the thing you're afraid of, you literally shift the brain's processing power away from the reactionary amygdala and into the prefrontal cortex.
Which is the logical part.
Right. It handles logic, reasoning, executive function. So you are literally changing the neurological pathway of the experience.
That makes the old analogy of like the monster in the dark bedroom a lot more clinical.
Oh, for sure.
Like as a kid, you see a looming shadow in the corner and your amygdala just screams, monster. But then turning on the light and getting the facts reveals it's just, a pile of laundry.
Right, exactly.
You haven't actually defeated a monster. You've just supplied your prefrontal cortex with the data it needed to turn down the volume of the panic response.
And that is exactly why the text makes intellectual honesty the prerequisite to emotional or spiritual peace. It acknowledges a crucial reality, which is that fear thrives on a lack of definition.
Right. It needs the dark to survive.
Yes. By stripping away the mystery, you define the boundaries of the threat.
But, defining the boundaries of the threat creates an obvious problem, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, sometimes you turn on the light, you gather the empirical facts, and you realize the situation actually is incredibly difficult.
Ah, yes.
Like the shadow wasn't a monster, but maybe it's a very real financial crisis or a scary medical diagnosis or, a daunting career leap. The facts actually confirm the danger.
They validate the fear, yeah.
So once you have stripped away the misinformation, what are you supposed to do with the lingering emotional weight of a very real, very factual fear?
That logical gap is exactly where the text moves from secular observation into its theological framework.
Okay, we're getting into step 2.
Right. Because intellectual understanding, while neurologically necessary to calm the immediate panic, It's rarely enough on its own to cure a deep, sustained phobia or anxiety.
It just tells you exactly what you're dealing with.
Exactly. So the text argues that once the facts are established, your focus has to shift entirely away from the phobia and onto a higher promise.
Right. And this is where the source material introduces a quote from the book of Isaiah, chapter 41, verse 10. And it specifically pulls from the Amplified Bible, Classic Edition, which is known for drawing out the nuanced meanings of original words.
Right, it expands on the definitions.
Yeah. And the phrase it highlights is, "Fear not, there is nothing to fear, for I am with you. I will strengthen and harden you to difficulties."
That's a very specific translation.
It is. And I want to zero in on that word harden, because that is a gritty, almost severe word choice.
It definitely is.
I don't read harden and think of like a warm, fuzzy blanket of spiritual peace. I think of building thick calluses.
Yes, like working with your hands.
Exactly.
Right.
So does this imply the text isn't actually promising that the frightening circumstances will just magically disappear?
If we look at the core philosophy of the text's argument, you've hit on the central thesis right there. It isn't promising an easy environment. It is promising an adapted individual.
Oh, that's interesting. An adapted individual.
Yeah. The text literally commands the reader to pay attention to the specific mechanics of that promise. I will strengthen and harden you.
Right.
In anatomy, there's this concept called Wolff's Law. It states that bones will adapt to the loads under which they are placed.
Okay, so like lifting weights for your skeleton.
Exactly. If a bone is subjected to heavy stress, it literally remodels itself, growing denser and thicker to withstand that specific pressure. The text is describing a spiritual and psychological version of Wolff's Law.
So the difficult circumstance is the physical stress on the bone.
Yes.
The text is saying that leaning on this faith-based promise doesn't remove the heavy weight, but it triggers the internal remodeling. You're the one who grows denser and more capable of carrying it.
Yes, exactly. The text follows up the Isaiah quote with a very specific proportional formula. It states, "As your faith in God grows stronger, the threat of your fears will grow weaker."
It's like a seesaw.
It's a total seesaw effect based entirely on proportion. The giant you are facing is still standing there exactly the same size it was yesterday.
Right, the diagnosis hasn't changed.
Right. But focusing on the promise actively fortifies you. It changes the ratio of power between you and the thing you're afraid of.
So the threat weakens not because the obstacle shrank, but because your capacity expanded.
Exactly. You've been hardened to the difficulty.
But I mean, intellectualizing this hardening is a trap, isn't it? Like if you just sit in your room thinking about getting tougher or repeating a verse over and over, you're essentially just meditating on your fear.
You're just spinning your wheels.
Right. The brain actually requires physical proof to rewire itself. So how does the text move someone from understanding this adaptation in theory to actually experiencing it in reality?
Well, the transition from internal theory to external reality is where the text's framework perfectly mirrors modern clinical psychology.
Really? Like actual therapy?
Yes, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy and graded exposure. The source outlines two subsequent phases for steps 3 and 4. First, it instructs the reader to relax.
Relax.
Okay. Yeah, you're told to imagine yourself peaceful, free from the bondage of the fear, and to actively envision the positive effects of your deliverance.
Which sounds, honestly, completely passive.
It does, until you see what immediately follows.
What's that?
Right after demanding this relaxed visualization, the text tells you to actively confront each one of your fear-triggering circumstances using baby steps.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it explicitly states that every single hurdle you conquer strengthens you.
The juxtaposition there is jarring, honestly.
It's a huge pivot.
You have this mandate to passively relax and visualize, placed right next to a mandate to actively walk into the very situations that trigger your phobias.
Right.
It feels like telling someone preparing for a massive public speech to sit in the green room, take deep breaths, and picture the audience giving a standing ovation.
Which is great for your heart rate.
Sure, you're locking in the baseline of peace.
Yeah.
But you can't stay in the green room forever. Eventually you have to walk out to the microphone and speak the first terrifying sentence.
And the text establishes a brilliant, necessary feedback loop between those two states. Internal peace and visualization, that green room mental rehearsal, are treated as absolute prerequisites for external action.
Okay, why is it a prerequisite, though?
Because if you try to aggressively confront your fear while your amygdala is still running a worst-case scenario simulation, you will likely trigger a full panic attack.
Oh, right. You just overwhelm the system again.
Exactly. You reinforce the trauma rather than curing it.
So you basically end up defeating yourself before you even cross the starting line because your nervous system is already redlining.
Exactly. So you establish the vision of peace first. You use the promises to anchor your prefrontal cortex. But then the text doesn't let you just meditate in safety.
Right, you have to take baby steps.
Yes, conquering small baby steps is how you practically apply the concept of hardening to difficulties from the Isaiah verse. You visualize the victory, then you take a small, manageable action.
Got it.
Taking that action provides the brain with the empirical proof it needs to validate the hardening.
Ah, so it's the psychological microfracture that makes the bone grow back denser.
That is a perfect way to phrase it. It is turning theological theory into lived mechanical experience. Getting hardened by that small step makes the next visualization easier.
Which naturally leads to a slightly bigger step.
Exactly. It is a systematic dismantling of the phobia through escalating physical evidence.
This brings us to a crucial pivot in the text then. We've moved from defining the fear to building internal capacity to taking small actions. But the final section of the source material demands an ultimate attitude shift.
Yes, the final step.
We are moving from a defensive posture, just trying to survive the anxiety, to a highly proactive, offensive posture.
This is where the text brings in its final major piece of scripture, and I'd say it is arguably the most demanding part of the entire framework.
Yeah, the text cites Jesus in the book of John, chapter 14, verse 27. This is from the New King James Version. It says, "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." And the text places massive emphasis on those two words, let not. It uses them as a direct, uncompromising instruction for the reader to become proactive.
It's essentially saying, don't allow fear to rule you.
Right. And then it uses incredibly aggressive imagery. It tells you to run towards your fears, just as the biblical figure David ran across the battlefield towards the giant Goliath.
It is a radical departure from how modern society usually manages anxiety.
Definitely.
We tend to focus on risk mitigation and avoidance. Running at the giant is entirely countercultural.
I have to push back hard on this specific framing, though,
Go for it.
because I could easily imagine someone listening to this right now who is deep in the trenches of a severe anxiety disorder or a paralyzing phobia.
Yes, a very real, debilitating situation.
Right. When you are in that state, hearing an authoritative voice say, well, just let not your heart be troubled. Framing fear is a simple choice. Feels like toxic positivity.
It can definitely come across that way.
It sounds like dismissive. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps advice. If a person could simply choose to let not their fear happen, they wouldn't be paralyzed in the first place.
That's entirely fair.
So how does the text bridge this massive, seemingly impossible gap between a person feeling utterly overwhelmed and a person confidently sprinting at a literal giant?
That is the most critical tension in the entire text, and it's a highly observant pushback.
Thanks. I mean, it just feels like a leap.
It does. If you only look at the let not command in isolation, it absolutely sounds like a demand for self-generated willpower, which, as we know, fails completely against genuine clinical phobias.
Right. Willpower isn't enough.
But to understand the mechanics of the let not command, we have to look at how the text concludes.
You mean the reflection and the prayer at the very end of the source material?
Yes, exactly. The closing reflection and the prayer provide the vital context that bridges that exact gap. Notice how the prayer begins. It doesn't begin with a declaration of strength. It begins with an admission of defeat. It says, Father God, today I feel overwhelmed by fear.
Oh. So it completely validates the paralysis.
Yeah.
It doesn't deny how devastating the physiological reality of the fear is.
It explicitly validates it. The text acknowledges that on your own, in your own strength, you are overwhelmed. The giant is bigger than you.
Wow. Okay, that shifts things.
Right. The bridge from being paralyzed to running at the giant isn't found by digging deeper into your own reserves of bravery. Instead, the prayer asks for something very specific. It asks for a perspective shift.
A perspective shift.
Yes, it prays that my perspective will shift so that my fear becomes small compared to how great you are.
Ah, that connects all the way back to the seesaw analogy of proportion we discussed earlier.
That is the linchpin of the whole system. The text doesn't demand self-generated bravery. It argues that the true courage required to run at the giant, to take that ultimate proactive stance, comes entirely from relying on a higher power to actually win the battle.
I see.
The let not isn't a command to conjure up courage out of nowhere. It is an invitation to shift your perspective so entirely onto the promises and capability of God that the fear naturally loses its grip on your nervous system.
It's basically saying you can run at the giant with complete confidence because you know you aren't the one who actually has to defeat it. You
Exactly.
just have to show up on the battlefield. The outcome isn't dependent on your muscle. It's dependent on the promise you've anchored yourself to.
You show up having gathered the facts to engage your prefrontal cortex and remove the mystery.
Right.
You show up having subjected yourself to Wolf's Law, hardening yourself by focusing on the promises rather than the threat.
The internal remodeling.
Yes, you
But
show up having visualized the peace and having taken the escalating baby steps to prove the concept to your brain.
the physical proof.
And the action of finally running toward the ultimate fear is simply the physical manifestation of a perspective shift that has already occurred internally.
That is a profound way to synthesize this material.
It really reframes the whole process.
It does. It takes a journey that feels incredibly daunting and chaotic and breaks it down into an architecture that is highly methodical.
Methodical, but deeply spiritual.
Yes, it honors the physiological reality of how our brains process terror, while simultaneously leaning into a deeply spiritual solution for the emotional weight that science alone can't cure.
Exactly.
To quickly recap this roadmap for you listening today, it starts by demanding that we act like Marie Curie. Gather the empirical facts to take away the mystery and shut down the amygdala's worst-case scenarios.
You establish the boundaries of the reality you are actually dealing with.
Then, instead of dwelling on that reality, you lean heavily on spiritual promises. You invite the psychological version of Wolf's Law, allowing the stress of the situation to remodel you so that you become hardened to the difficulties.
You focus on adapting to the environment rather than waiting for the environment to become easier.
Right. And from there, you marry passive visualization with active exposure therapy.
The green room and the stage.
Exactly. You rehearse the victory in your mind to establish a baseline of peace, and then you take actionable, tangible baby steps to prove to your nervous system that the fear can be navigated.
Right.
And ultimately, through a massive perspective shift, admitting your own overwhelm to rely on a higher power, you adopt that proactive let not mindset. You step out onto the battlefield, not in your own fragile strength, but anchored in something much larger than yourself.
It is a fascinating, highly effective blend of cognitive strategy and deep theological reliance. It demands intellectual honesty about the facts of your situation, while simultaneously demanding profound spiritual trust in the ultimate outcome.
It really is the ultimate synthesis of head and heart, of the clinical and the emotional.
It's absolutely.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on as you go about the rest of your day. We started this whole deep dive by looking at two seemingly contradictory lenses on the exact same human condition.
Right.
We looked at Marie Curie's scientific assertion that fear is nothing more than a lack of understanding. And we looked at the closing prayer's spiritual assertion that overcoming fear requires a divine perspective shift.
Both are basically arguing that fear is a distortion of reality.
So blending those two insights together, here is the question we want to leave you with today. Think about the giant currently standing in your way. What specific piece of misinformation or assumed mystery are you currently allowing to rule your peace of mind?
That's a powerful question.
And what is one highly factual, practical baby step you could take today to expose that shadow to the light?